Thank you very much for the honor of being inducted into the Accademia. And what I want to do is talk about what I believe is one of the most important innovations in the medical field. That is the introduction of randomized controlled trials for providing reliable evidence about the effects of treatment, and the way in which that has been subverted by bureaucracy without understanding the underlying principles. And to speak to the Accademia about its responsibility and its opportunity now to help rectify these problems. So in a nutshell, what is the key thing we're trying to do when evaluating treatment? We want to assess reliably both the safety and the efficacy, and in most cases, the treatments we have produce only moderate benefits. Therefore, we have to ensure that both the systematic errors in our evaluation, that the biases, and the random errors, the play of chance, are both known to be small, that we can be assured that they are small compared with the difference between a moderate effect, be it good or bad, and no material effect for patients. And to do this, and this is the key point, we have to use randomized controlled trials that are sufficiently large to reduce the random errors by having scale and by randomization to avoid bias. What has happened, though, since the randomized controlled trial was first introduced by Bradford Hill in the 1950s in the UK for the evaluation of streptomycin, was that a set of rules and regulations have been put in place with good intentions to both protect the safety, the rights, and the well-being of the participants in the trials, but perhaps without thinking enough about the safety of the people who will be treated or not treated as a consequence of the results of those trials. And the good intentions don't suffice unless one ensures one has effective strategies that are both proportionate and efficient. And that is where things have gone very badly wrong. In 1995, an organization created by the pharmaceutical industry with the major regulators of the US, the FDA, of Europe, EMA, and Japan, PMDA, pulled together a group involving no academics at all, between industry and the regulators, essentially to have a set of rules that would allow them to get their drug to market faster by having one international rule. And this was the International Committee on Harmonization, which published in 1995 its good clinical practice guidelines. The European Commission, without understanding that this was done for marketing purposes, then incorporated the ICH GCP rules into the EU Clinical Trial Directive, and indeed many other groups did as well. The Gates Foundation, Wellcome Trust. For something that was developed for marketing, these rules were applied across the board. In 2001, the EU implemented them. They were advised that this was going to cause problems. They ignored this advice. In 2009, they did a review of the impact of their directive, and they found from their own report it increased cost, it increased demand on scientific staff due to the inefficiencies, it was to the detriment of the safety of the clinical trial participants, and it was preventing innovative treatments from getting to market. So what did they do? They changed the directive into a regulation which continued to do all of these things: reduce safety, increase inefficiency, and prevent innovative treatments getting to market, despite having concluded in their own report that it was making it more costly and difficult to do such trials, to get reliable evidence about efficacy and safety, not only of new treatments, but of old treatments, treatments that were being used without evidence. So they created an environment that, with increased obstacles, delays, and costs for trials. What kind of costs are we talking about? Well, I'm a cardiovascular clinical trial and epidemiologist. One of the kind of genetic poster girls or poster boys for new treatments has been around PCSK9, the identification of this protein that was important in linking with the LDL cholesterol receptors, breaking them down, and that relating to the levels of cholesterol in the blood and the risk of coronary artery disease, a new target for treatment. Antibody therapy was developed to reduce PCSK9 levels, and it did. It could halve your cholesterol level with an injection every few weeks, injection under the skin. A single trial by one of the companies, by Amgen, cost between $1 and $2 billion. Single randomized controlled trials of about 28,000 patients. Because it was so costly, because they were in competition with other companies, they were in a rush to get it to market, so they ran the trial only for a couple of years, although we know from previous trials of cholesterol-lowering therapy, in particular with the statins, that it takes 4 or 5 years before you see the benefit emerging. So despite spending $2 billion, they got the wrong answer. They underestimated the benefit of lowering cholesterol. They failed to demonstrate the effects of lowering cholesterol on mortality. They actually set back the field by spending $2 billion in that regulatory environment. A catastrophe. But even worse, what it did was it pushed the companies to lobby against randomized trials and said, look, we have big databases. We have big computers. We have smart statisticians. We don't need to randomize. We can use observational data where people are getting treatment and compare that with their outcomes compared with those who are not. So-called real-world evidence from observational studies. And to my shame, because I am also a fellow of the Academy of Medical Sciences, that lobbying got that academy to put out a report where they proposed that such real-world evidence, such observational data, was an alternative to the evidence generated by randomized controlled trials. This is such a false conclusion that it really is a shame on that particular academy, and I know you'll be meeting with them, so please do remind them of that shame when you see them. Why is that such a shame? Well, observational studies where you look at the outcome among people who are exposed to something versus those who are not can be very useful for picking up big effects on rare outcomes. For example, that's how Bradford Hill and Dole identified that smoking was a cause of lung cancer. Lung cancer was a rare event, then it became a relatively common event, and there is a more than 10-fold increase in the risk of lung cancer among those who smoke versus those who not. Similarly, there is a rare complication with statin therapy, a cholesterol-lowering agent, where people get muscle pain associated with big increases in muscle enzyme, creatine kinase. About 1 per 10,000 per annum will get that excess. And if that is continued, if the treatment is continued, then that breaking down of muscle can go to the kidney, can damage the kidney and cause so-called rhabdomyolysis, where you have breakdown of muscle and damage to renal function, in about 1 per 100,000. So a very rare outcome, a very big excess of myopathy can be detected in these observational studies. But the people who get cholesterol-lowering therapy are often older. They are often subject to many other complications, and they report other things that happen to them, particularly when the doctor says, I'm giving you this tablet. Sometimes, very, very rarely, it can cause muscle problems. Let me know if you have muscle problems. Now, the only way you can know whether common muscle problems occur with the drug is by comparing in a randomized trial people who are getting a real statin versus people who are getting a dummy tablet, a so-called placebo. And the reason is that in observational studies, they're prone to various sources of confounding and bias. So when you take people who are getting a treatment, that is, people who are getting a statin, people who are not getting a statin, there's a reason why someone is getting a statin and not getting a statin. The underlying risk of health outcomes is different. A doctor gives a treatment to people who are unwell or at high risk and may have other complications. They're not the same as those who don't get the treatment. There's also the differences in ascertainment. If a doctor gives you a tablet and says you might get a muscle problem, you know you're taking the tablet. If you're not taking the tablet, you know you're not taking the tablet. So the ascertainment is a problem. However, when we have randomized placebo-controlled comparisons, as in this combination of all of the large randomized placebo-controlled trials, we can actually detect reliably, because we've avoided bias and we have large numbers, we've avoided random error, whether or not there is an effect. And so here you see the histogram. In the first year, an excess of about 10 or 11 per 1,000 during that first year. And then in the subsequent years, no difference between active statin versus placebo. And what's interesting, again, is you can see that in the first year, there's a very much higher reporting rate because, of course, when the tablets were given to the patients, they were told you might get muscle problems, and so they report them. But there's no difference, or very small difference, between the statin and placebo. So bear in mind that 11 per 1,000, or if you like, 1%. When you look at the claims based on observational data in these two papers, completely misleading claims that 20% get disabling symptoms, muscle symptoms, that 18% get side effects due to statins, not 1%. So the biases are massive compared with the real effects. And it's not just sort of side effects like muscle. What about claims that statins might be protective against cancer, which have been made? Well, again, we can go to that combination of all the large randomized controlled trials and look to see whether during 5 years of treatment, is there any difference in the rate of cancer among people who get statin versus control? The solid vertical line that you see here is the relative risk of 1, that is no difference, with a confidence interval, a 95% confidence interval. And so you can see that there is little or no difference in the rate of cancer at different sites or overall among people who get a statin or control. And indeed, in many of these trials, they've continued long-term follow-up over 10, 15 years after the trial ended, and no evidence of a beneficial effect on cancer. But claims in major journals based on non-randomized observational studies say different things. So here is, in the UK, in the medical literature, the New England Journal of Medicine, one of our most prestigious journals, a whole population study, so the perfect observational study from the whole of the Denmark registry, health registry, claiming that if you take a statin, you will lower your risk of getting cancer by around 15%. Now, what it's showing here is how much statin you get. It even seems to suggest that if you lick the tablet, that is enough to reduce your risk of cancer by 15%, despite my previous trial, which showed that this is nonsense. But this slide itself already shows it's nonsense. Cholesterol lowering with a statin lowers the risk of heart disease. It lowers the risk of death from heart disease. That has been shown unequivocally. And yet, this same picture from the New England Journal suggests that taking statins increases your risk of heart disease and of dying from heart disease. I mean, how this is published, how people feel that this is science is, I think, quite beyond me. And of course, you can get a statistician who can analyze away that excess of mortality from cardiovascular disease, but that doesn't mean that you have corrected for all of the other errors. So consequently, this approach is just not adequate for detecting the kinds of effects of treatment, both good and bad, that we have on common health outcomes. And this was pointed out by the US FDA Commissioner, that this emphasis on observational studies could result in poorly conceived studies and analytic decisions that generate incorrect or unreliable conclusions. These regulatory obstacles are preventing treatments from being developed. This is analysis in the US of the top 10 drugs. Between 2000 and 2015, the sales of the top 10 drugs went up by 2.5-fold. But the population covered by those drugs went down by 7.5-fold. Because the cost of developing treatments for population-wide problems has become so costly, pharmaceutical industry is moving away from dealing with the big public health complications. It is distorting the research agenda and reducing creative collaborations. It has created a new industry, the contract research organization industry, which if you wanted to invest in 1995, when ICH started with its guidelines, would have been a good plan. This is an exponential curve, and you can see there's no evidence that it's going to shift unless academies like yours and ours make a change, really push for change. It's costing enormous amounts of money to develop a new drug, and that's preventing these drugs from being developed. This is the kind of cost that's occurring. This is the example I took from the PCSK9 study that I showed you earlier. It is actually, even within the good clinical practice guidelines, in terms of compliance, one can streamline this substantially and make it possible for innovative treatments to get to market. But at this very moment, ICH is reviewing its guidelines, and we need to push for the right change. WHO is reviewing guidelines for clinical trials, and the academies need to make their voice heard to ensure that these treatments that this approach gets changed. There's undue focus on complying with rules rather than on innovation in the design and conduct of trials. When you do a randomized controlled trials, the regulators ask you to keep on telling them about adverse events that occur, which is a complete waste of time because you have a randomized placebo-controlled trial. What you're trying to do is detect whether there are differences. So reporting just events that are occurring is not informative. Comparing events that occur during the trial between the treatment and placebo group is informative. This is a trial that we ran of niacin, a treatment that had been available on the market in the US for 50 years, that none of the regulatory assessment of side effects had detected any problems with it. We were able to show in a randomized trial that it caused hospitalization for infection, hospitalization for bleeding, new onset diabetes. None of that picked up during 50 years. Randomized controlled trials prevented this $1 billion a year industry from continuing to harm patients. And the European Society of Cardiology, in a position paper in 2013 and a more recent publication earlier this year, has really argued for these regulatory barriers to properly conducting clinical trials to be removed. We do need change. Can it be done? Well, in a pandemic, yes. Back in the 1980s, the way in which we were able to demonstrate how to treat a heart attack by dissolving the blood clot and by using antiplatelet therapy with aspirin, by the ISIS group led from Oxford with Peter Sleight, Richard Pito, Salim Youssef, and myself, and the GC group led by Gianni Tognoni from Milan, used very streamlined studies to demonstrate how to save lives in a heart attack. This approach was used in the pandemic with a very simple streamlined trial. 50,000 patients were randomized in the UK, 10,000 in the first 100 days, across the whole of the UK. It demonstrated that a cheap, simple treatment, dexamethasone, could reduce mortality for the sickest patients by 30%. And yet, in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of an emergency, the regulators harassed us for 6 months, going through all of the paperwork while we were trying to work out how to save lives. This is insane. It has to stop. So, in conclusion, with 10 seconds to go, just before the pandemic started, we made this plea in a paper in the New England Journal about the magic of randomization versus the myth of real-world evidence, arguing that there was a need to really push back and to change the way in which we evaluated treatment for the benefit of our patients. And I hope that you and other academies will really push on this in the next few months, because it's a critical time, and perhaps it's something also that with the G7 could be done. Thank you very much.